Something existed before the first human breath. The text hints at it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Most people open Genesis and begin at verse 1. They read about light, water, sky, land. They read about Adam, formed from dust on the sixth day. And they assume the story begins there. But what if Scripture tells a longer story? What if heaven had a history before earth had a name? That's not a fringe idea. That's not borrowed from mythology. It's written in plain sight in the oldest books of Scripture. Let's slow down and look carefully. Job 38 is one of the oldest books in the Bible. Most scholars place it among the earliest Hebrew texts we possess. In chapter 38, God speaks to Job from a whirlwind. He asks a question that should stop every careful reader cold. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? That alone is weighty. But what comes next is what most people miss. God continues, "When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Pause there. The sons of God were already present. They were watching when earth's foundations were being laid. They were singing. They were rejoicing. Adam was not yet formed. Eve had not yet drawn breath. But something or someone was already bearing witness to creation. This is where the question begins. Not in speculation, not in tradition, in Scripture itself. Before we go further, let's establish how we'll approach this. This is not an attempt to tell you what to believe. It is an attempt to show you what is written. There is an important difference between what Scripture states directly and what Scripture allows us to carefully infer. We'll keep those two things separate throughout. When we move from explicit text into interpretation, you'll know. Because the text deserves honesty more than it deserves excitement. So who are the sons of God in Job 38? In Hebrew, that phrase, B'nai Elohim, appears in several key passages. In Job chapters 1 and 2, the sons of God present themselves before God. Satan comes among them. The context makes clear these are heavenly beings, not human beings. In Genesis 6, the phrase appears again in one of the most debated passages in all of Scripture. But in Job 38, the context leaves little room for confusion. These are beings who existed before humanity. They witnessed Earth's foundations being laid. They responded with joy. The text does not say they walked on Earth. It says they watched Earth being created. That distinction matters, and we'll return to it. But what we can say with confidence, grounded in the text, is that heavenly beings pre-existed Adam. That's not a theory. That's Job 38. Now look again at Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We've heard that verse so many times it can stop landing. Read it slowly. God created the heavens and the earth. Not the earth alone. Not the earth first. The heavens are listed at the beginning. The spiritual realm was already established. The dwelling place of angelic beings was ordered. And only then, through 6 days of creative work, did the visible earth take its final shape. By the time humanity arrived, the heavens were already occupied, already filled with beings who had witnessed the whole process. That is consistent with Job 38. The sons of God existed before Adam. They saw what Adam never saw. Let's move to a second clue. This one comes from Ezekiel 28. The chapter begins as judgment against the king of Tyre. That's the framing. That's where it starts. But around verse 12, the language begins to shift. The description outgrows any human figure. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you. You were anointed as a guardian cherub. You were on the holy mountain of God. You were blameless in your ways, from the day you were created, till wickedness was found in you. Let's be very careful here. Some scholars read this as entirely symbolic language. They argue the text uses cosmic imagery to describe a proud earthly king, a rhetorical technique common in ancient Near Eastern literature. That interpretation is legitimate. It should not be dismissed. But other scholars look at the phrase anointed guardian cherub and the words blameless from the day you were created, and argue the text has moved beyond any human being. No king of Tyre was ever a cherub. No human ruler walked on the holy mountain of God. The text may carry two layers at once. An earthly king who shadows a heavenly figure, whose fall preceded Eden itself. We cannot press this into certainty. But the honest position is this. Scripture hints at something here. The language is larger than any earthly ruler. We hold the hint. We don't invent what's missing. A third clue lives in Genesis 1:2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. The Hebrew phrase translated without form and void is tohu vabohu. This exact word combination appears only 3 times in the entire Old Testament. Here in Genesis 1, in Isaiah 34, describing aftermath of divine judgment on Edom, and in Jeremiah 4, where a prophet describes what sounds like a world laid waste. In Jeremiah 4:23-26, I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty. Its lights had gone out. I looked, and there were no people. Every bird in the sky had flown away. The language mirrors Genesis 1:2 almost exactly. And in Jeremiah it follows devastation, ruin after judgment, aftermath. Some scholars, those who hold what's called the gap theory, point to this parallel and argue Genesis 1:2 implies prior ruin. Something happened before verse 3 begins. Something that left the earth formless, dark, and empty. Others, equally serious and equally qualified, argue tohu vabohu simply describes uncreated, unformed matter, raw material waiting for the Creator's shaping hand. No prior catastrophe required. Both positions are held by credible biblical scholars. We are not going to settle that debate here. But you need to know it exists. Because if there is silence between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, that silence may hold more history than most of us were taught. The text allows the question. It does not answer it with certainty. A fourth clue. This one is harder to set aside. By the time Genesis 3 opens, a being is already in the garden. The text describes it as more crafty than any creature God had made. It had knowledge, it had speech, it carried an agenda that predated Adam's first morning. Whatever this being was, it arrived in Eden, with a history already behind it. Scripture later identifies this serpent with Satan. Revelation 12:9 calls him the ancient serpent. Jesus himself, in Luke 10:18, says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That fall had already occurred, before the garden, before the test, before Eve was formed from Adam's side. By the time humanity faced its first choice, the adversary had already made his. This is not inference. This is the storyline Scripture gives us directly. A rebellion in heaven preceded the fall of man on earth. Whatever transpired in the heavenly realm before Genesis 3, the fingerprints of it are visible from the very first pages of human history. Now let's be clear about what we can and cannot conclude. The Bible clearly establishes that heavenly beings existed before Adam. Job 38 states that without ambiguity, the Bible clearly shows that by the time humans appeared, the spiritual realm was already ancient and complex. A rebellion had occurred. A fallen being was already operating with intent. What the Bible does not clearly establish is that angels physically walked the earth before Adam. It does not give us pre-Adamic angelic civilizations. It does not describe heavenly beings inhabiting continents, building, dwelling, living as humans would. Some ancient texts outside the canon have explored those ideas. Some traditions have speculated in that direction. But Scripture itself holds a boundary, and that boundary is worth honoring. Not because the question isn't interesting, because the text is more trustworthy than our imaginations. Here is what makes this more remarkable than any speculation. The picture Scripture does paint is already astonishing. Before humanity drew its first breath, a cosmic drama was already unfolding. The heavens were ordered and inhabited. Beings of extraordinary capacity existed in God's presence. One of the highest among them fell. By the time God said, "Let us make man," the universe already had witnesses. The earth already had a watcher at its edge. And then, into all of that, God formed a man from dust, breathed into him, and something new entered the story. Think about that. Adam didn't arrive in an empty universe. He arrived in one that already had history, a history he was not given in full, a story already in motion before he opened his eyes. And yet, when God created humanity, he gave humans something not given to any other created being, his own image. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. That phrase has occupied theologians for centuries. What does it mean to bear God's image? At minimum, it marks a unique relationship, a unique dignity, a unique calling. Whatever existed before Adam, nothing else is described as image-bearing the way humanity is. The sons of God watched creation with joy, but they were not told to fill the earth and subdue it. They were not given dominion over living things. That mandate, that weight, and that honor was placed on Adam. Whatever the pre-Adamic spiritual world looked like, humanity's arrival was not an afterthought. It was not a late addition to a story already finished. It was the moment the story had been moving toward. Let's bring this to a close. We began in Job 38. God asks where Job was when earth's foundations were laid, while the sons of God were already there, already singing. We walked through Ezekiel 28 with careful eyes, language larger than any earthly king, hinting at a heavenly figure whose fall may predate Eden. We looked at Tohu Vabohu in Genesis 1-2 and the honest scholarly debate over what it implies. We noted that Genesis 3 opens with a fallen being already present, which means heavenly history had moved before human history began. These are the biblical clues, not proof of angels walking earth in prehistoric ages, not evidence of pre-Adamic beings living on land, but clear textual evidence that before Adam, heaven had a story, that before humanity drew its first breath, something had already watched, already chosen, already fallen. The Bible is quieter than we expect, and deeper than we are taught. It doesn't give us a timeline of angelic life before Genesis. It gives us something better, the shape of a story that was already ancient, when our first father opened his eyes. And it invites us to hold that with wonder, not with fear, not with speculation dressed as certainty, with the posture Job eventually learned, humility before a story so vast that no single human mind can fully hold it. Read Job 38 again with this in mind. Let those morning stars sing. Let those sons of God shout for joy at earth's foundation, and sit with the quiet truth that when God formed you, something in the heavens was already watching, not to threaten you, but because the story had always been leading somewhere, and you are part of where it leads. Think about that.